Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will enter the world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, where the gentle rhythm of village life can sometimes mask the most sinister of deeds. Take a moment to settle in, perhaps with a cup of tea, and let the flickering firelight play upon the shadows of your imagination. For in the heart of St. Mary Mead, amidst the polite smiles and polished antiques, a chilling tale is about to unfold. We shall observe with Miss Jane Marple, a woman whose keen mind sees beyond appearances into the very core of human nature. Prepare yourselves, for not all that glitters is gold, and sometimes the most valuable possessions carry the deadliest price. Now let's start with the first chapter of Death at the Auction House. Chapter 1. The Fall of Mr. Croft. The air in the grand ballroom of Ashworth Manor, usually reserved for the annual village fete, was thick with the scent of old wood polish, lavender, and the eager anticipation of a good bargain. Sunlight, filtered through the tall, mullioned windows, cast long, dusty beams across the array of curiosities, chipped porcelain, tarnished silver, and heavy, dark furniture. It was early April, 1922, and the contents of the late Lady Ashworth's estate were being put under the hammer. Miss Jane Marple, a figure of delicate appearance in her tweed skirt and sensible cardigan, sat quietly in the third row, her knitting needles clicking with a comforting, rhythmic sound. Her bright blue eyes, however, missed nothing. She noted the anxious flush on Mr. Bartholomew Finch, the auctioneer's face, a man known locally more for his theatrical flair than his business acumen. She observed Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the formidable local collector, perched like a hawk, ready to swoop. And she certainly noticed Mr. Silas Croft, a man whose reputation for ruthless acquisition preceded him. Croft, a stout, florid-faced gentleman, with a booming laugh and an even louder opinion, was the embodiment of the successful, if not entirely beloved, antique dealer. He sat a few rows ahead of Miss Marple, conspicuously adjusting his spectacles, a catalogue gripped firmly in his hand. The auction proceeded with the usual mix of dull and desirable lots. A particularly coveted item was a rare 18th-century brass nautical compass, encased in rosewood and said to have belonged to a famous explorer. The bidding for this compass had been spirited, almost aggressive, with Mr. Croft ultimately securing it after a fierce volley of bids against Mrs. Vance, whose sharp intake of breath at her defeat was audible even from Miss Marple's seat. Mr. Croft had clutched the small, heavy object with a triumphant grin, a glint of pure avarice in his eyes. Later, as the afternoon wore on and the crowds began to thin, Miss Marple rose to stretch her legs. She was considering a rather charming, if slightly chipped, teacup set. Her gaze drifted towards the antechamber where collected items were being processed. She saw Mr. Croft there, still holding the compass, engaged in a low, intense conversation with Mr. Finch, the auctioneer. Their voices were too hushed to discern, but their postures spoke volumes. Finch, hunched and defensive. Croft, expansive and clearly agitated. Suddenly Mr. Croft stiffened. His florid face went a ghastly pale, then purple. He clutched his chest, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. The brass compass slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly on the polished floor, its glass face cracking. A low groan escaped. Him, before he collapsed, a heavy, ungraceful heap amidst a pile of velvet curtains and discarded catalogues. A collective gasp swept through the remaining few. Mr. Finch, the auctioneer, rushed forward, his face now truly ashen. Good heavens! Mr. Croft, Dr. Alistair Finch, the auctioneer's elder brother, and the village physician, who had been lingering near the refreshment table, was quickly by his side. He knelt, fumbled for a pulse, and then, after a moment that felt unnaturally long in The sudden silence rose slowly. His expression was grave. "It appears Mr. Croft has suffered a severe coronary event, a heart attack, I fear." Miss Marple watched, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She noted Dr. Finch's surprisingly swift pronouncement, the way his gaze flickered almost imperceptibly towards his brother, and the strange, almost too perfect stillness of Mr. Croft's body. Most of all, she noted the small, dark mark that seemed to bloom on the deceased man's pale, outstretched hand just above the wrist. It was a detail easily missed in the general confusion, a tiny, almost insignificant blemish against the backdrop of a sudden, tragic death. A tragic death, perhaps. But Miss Marple had a lifetime of observation that suggested things were rarely as simple as they first appeared, and that small mark bothered her. The village constable, P.C. Johnson, was summoned. He was a young man, earnest but inexperienced, and he deferred largely to Dr. Finch's medical opinion. The official narrative was already taking shape. A man, of robust appetite and perhaps equally robust temper, succumbing to the inevitable strains of a lively auction. But Miss Marple's intuition, honed over decades of watching human folly and malice unfold in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, whispered otherwise. That small, dark mark, like a faint bruise, seemed to burn in her memory. It was unsettling. Chapter 2. Whispers and Wickedness. The news of Mr. Silas Croft's sudden demise spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire through dry kindling. By breakfast the next morning, every household had its own version, embellished with personal theories and local gossip. The general consensus, encouraged by Dr. Alastair Finch's prompt medical opinion, was that Mr. Croft had simply succumbed to his own excesses. "Too much rich food and too much excitement, bless his soul," opined Mrs. Price from the dairy, stirring her tea with vigorous nods. Miss Marple, however, found herself unusually pensive over her morning toast. The image of Mr. Croft's collapse, the clatter of the compass, and above all, that faint, dark mark on his wrist refused to dislodge itself from her mind. She had seen enough of life and death to know that even the most natural ends could, sometimes, have unnatural beginnings. Later that morning, as she took her usual stroll to the village shop for yarn, she found herself caught in a flurry of hushed conversations. Young Arthur Pemberton, a nervous, gangly lad who assisted Mr. Bartholomew Finch at the auction house, was visibly distraught. He was recounting his version of events to Mrs. Wither, the postmistress, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he just went down, Mrs. Wither, like a sack of potatoes. Dr. Finch was so quick, wasn't he? Said it was his heart. Poor Mr. Croft, always so lively." Arthur wrung his hands, his eyes darting around as if expecting Mr. Croft to reappear. Miss Marple paused, pretending to examine a display of ribbons. "He seemed quite agitated just before, didn't he, Arthur?" she inquired gently, her voice soft but clear. "With Mr. Finch, the auctioneer?" Arthur jumped, startled by her presence. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, well, Mr. Croft always did like to haggle, even after the hammer fell. They were talking about the compass, I think. Mr. Croft seemed very pleased he'd got it, but Mr. Finch, he looked quite put out, if you ask me, like he'd lost." "A bet," Mrs. Wither chimed in. "And no wonder after the prices Mr. Croft paid for some of those pieces. He was a real shark, that one, always getting the better of folks. I heard he even got the Ashworth family to sell some things for a song years ago, claiming they were fakes, only to sell them on for a fortune." Her eyes narrowed. Plenty of people had reason to dislike Silas Croft. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The list of those with a grievance against Mr. Croft was likely long. He was a man who built his empire on the misfortunes or naivety of others. But dislike was one thing, murder quite another. Yet the thought persisted. Later, she encountered Inspector Craddock, a relative newcomer to the district, inspecting the manor grounds with P.C. Johnson. Craddock was a capable man, if sometimes a little too straightforward for the subtle nuances of village life. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat. "A sad business, Mr. Croft. Still one expects it with a man of his constitution." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her gaze sweeping over the manor's imposing facade, which seemed to hold its secrets rather close. "Though one does wonder, did Dr. Finch seem quite sure of his diagnosis?" Craddock shrugged. "Absolutely. Coronary thrombosis. A textbook case," he said, though he did mention Mr. Croft had a nasty scrape on his wrist, probably from falling onto some debris. Bit of a mystery that, but nothing to do with the heart, of course. A scrape. Miss Marple suppressed a small sigh. It was precisely the kind of detail that could be dismissed as incidental by a less discerning eye. But she had seen it more clearly than a mere scrape. It had been a precise, almost circular mark, a darker hue against his pallor. Unlike any ordinary injury from a fall, it was too neat, and it was there before he fully collapsed, she was certain. The inspector continued, "We'll just be wrapping up here. No foul play indicated, just a tragic end to a rather avaricious life, eh?" He chuckled, a sound that seemed to grate against the quiet dignity of the manor. Miss Marple merely offered a polite smile, but her mind was racing. A nasty scrape, casually dismissed, a rapid diagnosis, the sudden violent collapse of a man who, for all his faults, was robust. And a very valuable compass now lying in police evidence, its face cracked, its history perhaps known only to the man who now lay dead. The inspector saw only an open and shut case. Miss Marple, however, saw a tapestry of subtle inconsistencies beginning to weave itself, a tapestry that hinted not at natural causes but at something far more deliberate, far more wicked. And that small mark, dismissed as a scrape, was a single, unsettling stitch in its emerging pattern. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Hesitation. 2 days later, the post-mortem report arrived, quietly disrupting the village's settled narrative. Instead of merely confirming Dr. Finch's initial diagnosis, it introduced a jarring note of discord. The official cause of death was indeed heart failure, but the report also detailed the presence of a minute quantity of a fast-acting poison, a rare digitalis derivative, in Mr. Croft's system. Not enough for an outright obvious poisoning, but just enough when combined with his known heart condition to tip the scales catastrophically. The coronary event was no accident. Inspector Craddock returned to Ashworth Manor, his previous air of confident closure replaced by a frustrated frown. P.C. Johnson, looking even more out of his depth, followed him, clutching a notebook. Miss Marple, alerted by a chance conversation with a frantic Mrs. Finch, the auctioneer's wife, made her way to the manor ostensibly to inquire about a lost umbrella. "Poison!" Craddock exclaimed, pacing the antechamber where Mr. Croft had fallen, his voice echoing in the now quiet space. "A digitalis derivative. It's almost undetectable in such small doses, designed to mimic a natural heart attack. Someone wanted Mr. Croft dead, and they wanted it to look like fate." He slammed a fist lightly on a dusty table. Now, who would have access to such a substance? And when was it administered? Dr. Alistair Finch was summoned. He arrived looking pale and visibly distressed, his usual calm demeanor shattered. This is unbelievable, Inspector," he stammered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I examined him. I was certain. A textbook coronary. How could I have missed it?" "With respect, Doctor," Craddock said, his tone sharper. "The Report states the poison was present. It's a very subtle effect, perhaps designed to be missed. But you were very quick with your pronouncement, weren't you? Dr. Finch flinched. I was under pressure, the shock of it all. And Silas was a patient of mine. I knew his heart history. It seemed so obvious at the time. He avoided Craddock's gaze, looking instead at the spot where Croft had fallen, a vague horror in his eyes. Miss Marple, hovering discreetly by an alcove, absorbed every nuance. She noticed the way Dr. Finch nervously adjusted his spectacles, the slight tremor in his hands, and a fleeting expression of something akin to guilt that crossed his face. It wasn't the look of a murderer, perhaps, but certainly of a man with a heavy conscience, a man who might have known something or suspected something, and yet remained silent. "And the mark on his wrist, Doctor?" Craddock pressed. "The one you dismissed as a scrape?" Dr. Finch visibly stiffened. "A minor abrasion, Inspector. I assumed he'd grazed it on the table as he fell. Nothing significant. The report describes it as a small, circular puncture wound, consistent with an injection or perhaps the sting of a particular insect, though no insect was found. Could that have been the point of entry for the poison?" Dr. Finch's face went a shade paler. I suppose it's possible, but I really didn't see it as anything more than a scrape at the time." His voice trailed off, his eyes darting towards his brother Bartholomew, who had just entered the room, drawn by the raised voices. Bartholomew Finch looked equally rattled, his auctioneer's confidence utterly evaporated. "This is preposterous!" Bartholomew burst out. "Murder at my auction? Silas Croft was a loud-mouthed old fool, but who would want to poison him, and what on earth for?" Craddock ignored him, his gaze fixed on Dr. Finch. "Tell me, Doctor, what precisely did you do when you first reached Mr. Croft?" Dr. Finch swallowed hard. "I checked for a pulse, felt his chest. Then I unbuttoned his cuff just to be sure. He was wearing a rather tight sleeve, you see." "Unbuttoned his cuff?" Miss Marple murmured to herself, a fresh piece clicking into place. "Yes, that's when the mark would have become clearly visible, and that's when Dr. Finch would have seen it. He hadn't just dismissed it, he had downplayed it deliberately. But why? The revelation of the poison had opened a Pandora's box. The village was no longer merely buzzing with gossip. It was simmering with fear and suspicion. A murderer walked among them, a person cunning enough to make death look natural and audacious enough to strike in a public place. Miss Marple, however, no longer saw just a single death. She saw a carefully constructed deception, and Dr. Finch's hesitation, his deliberate underplaying of that small circular mark, seemed to her to be the first significant crack in its meticulously crafted facade. The doctor, she suspected, knew far more than he was letting on, and his silence was as chilling as the poison itself. Chapter 4. The compass and its secrets. The brass nautical compass, the object of Mr. Croft's final triumph, and the last thing he held, became the focal point of Inspector Craddock's investigation. It was taken into evidence, carefully wrapped, its cracked glass face a silent testament to the tragic events. But its true significance, Miss Marple felt, lay not in its monetary value alone, but in what it represented, or perhaps what it contained. She made a point of visiting Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the formidable collector who had been outbid by Mr. Croft. Mrs. Vance lived in a rather grand, if overly cluttered house on the edge of the village, filled to the brim with antiques that she guarded with the ferocity of a dragon. "A dreadful business about Mr. Croft, wasn't it?" Miss Marple began, accepting a cup of lukewarm tea. Mrs. Vance snorted, her sharp eyes glinting. "Dreadful for him, perhaps. I dare say he had it coming. The man was a vulture and a cheat. He—" Once swindled old Lady Abernathy out of a family heirloom for a pittance, claiming it was a modern reproduction, only to sell it on for a princely sum in London. I heard he was quite keen on that compass, Miss Marple ventured. Keen? Mrs. Vance scoffed. He was obsessed. He knew its true worth, of course, more than even Mr. Finch, the auctioneer, let on. It was a very rare commander's compass from the East India Company, unique for its unusual engraving on the base, a small, stylized lotus flower. I've only ever seen one other like it in an old catalogue from a private collection. Its history alone makes it invaluable, quite apart from its craftsmanship. Miss Marple nodded. And you were bidding for it too, I recall? Naturally, I had my eye on it for years, ever since I heard Ashworth Manor might be selling its contents. But Croft, blast him, always had deeper pockets, or perhaps deeper information. Mrs. Vance leaned forward conspiratorially. There's a rumour, you know, that these particular compasses sometimes had secret compartments. Not all of them, mind, but the very earliest ones, the most elaborate. Perhaps for maps, or coded messages during voyages. Who knows what secrets Mr. Croft was hoping to uncover? This was the first Miss Marple had heard of such a rumour, a secret compartment. This detail resonated strongly with her intuition. Mr. Croft wasn't just acquiring an antique, he was acquiring a mystery. Later she had a brief, seemingly casual conversation with Lady Ashworth herself, the elderly and rather frail owner of the manor, who was still reeling from the events. Lady Ashworth was a woman of faded elegance, now burdened by debt. Such a shock, Miss Marple, Lady Ashworth sighed, clutching a lace handkerchief. Poor Mr. Croft, though I must admit he was a rather trying man. He insisted on examining that compass days before the auction, kept coming back to it, almost as if he knew something about it that we didn't. He even offered to buy it privately, but Mr. Finch insisted on keeping it for the auction. Did he say why he was so interested, dear Lady Ashworth? Miss Marple asked gently. Oh, he mumbled something about its unique historical value and how he had a client who was exceptionally keen on that specific design. Lady Ashworth paused, her brow furrowing. He was quite insistent on examining the base, I remember. The lotus engraving, said it was particularly rare. The lotus engraving, Mrs. Vance had mentioned it too. Miss Marple's mind began to churn. A rare engraving, a rumour of secret compartments, and Mr. Croft's intense, almost predatory interest. It suggested that the compass held more than just sentimental or historical value. It might contain a clue, a document, perhaps something that could threaten someone or reveal a hidden truth. As the day closed, Inspector Craddock paid a visit to Miss Marple, a sign that his frustration was growing. We've searched Croft's belongings, Miss Marple. Nothing. No notes about the poison, no enemies clearly identified. He was hated by many, but not to the point of murder, one would think. And the compass, Inspector? Miss Marple inquired. Craddock sighed. Still in evidence. We've examined it thoroughly, just a very fine antique compass. No hidden compartments, no secret messages, just a cracked face, a very valuable cracked face. Miss Marple's gentle smile did not quite reach her eyes. Are you quite certain, Inspector? Sometimes things are hidden in plain sight, or disguised as something else entirely. Mr. Croft, I imagine, was a man who understood the value of a well-kept secret, and often a secret is worth more than gold, or indeed a life. She reflected on the day's conversations, Mr. Croft's almost feverish interest in the compass, his aggressive bidding, and then his immediate hushed conversation with Mr. Bartholomew Finch, the auctioneer. What could they have been discussing so intensely just moments before Croft's death? Was it about the compass's value or about its secrets? The compass, seemingly an innocent antique, was now undoubtedly linked to the murder, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion that its secrets, if indeed they existed, were not merely historical but very much alive and dangerous, providing a motive far stronger than a simple auction rivalry. The fact that the police found nothing hidden only deepened her suspicion that someone had already found it and gone to lethal lengths to keep its contents quiet. Chapter 5. The Auctioneer's Unease. The shadow of suspicion had fallen heavily upon Mr. Bartholomew Finch, the auctioneer. His nervous disposition, his hushed conversation with Mr. Croft moments before the death, and the sudden revelation of the poison had made him the natural focus of the village's rumour mill and Inspector Craddock's renewed scrutiny. Miss Marple, armed with her knitting and an air of gentle concern, paid a call to the Finch residence. Mrs. Finch, a flustered woman, perpetually on the verge of tears, greeted her. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all so dreadful. Barty hasn't slept a wink. The inspector keeps asking him questions, and he says he doesn't know anything, but who believes him?" Bartholomew Finch himself soon appeared, looking like a man haunted. His usually slicked-back hair was dishevelled, and his eyes, usually glinting with a shrewd energy, were now shadowed with fatigue and worry. He offered Miss Marple a weak smile. "Miss Marple, so kind of you to call. This whole affair is a nightmare. My reputation is in tatters." "A very unfortunate business, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking softly. "I believe you were speaking with Mr. Croft just before his collapse." Bartholomew wrung his hands. Yes, we were. He was quite pleased with his acquisition of the compass, you see. Very pleased indeed. Said it was worth far more than the final bid. He was gloating, I suppose. Gloating about the compass itself, or something else? Miss Marple pressed gently. Bartholomew hesitated. Well, he did make a rather cryptic comment. He said something about having finally secured the key to an old lock. I thought he was just being metaphorical, referring to the compass's rarity. Silas Croft was always one for dramatic pronouncements. "And you were also discussing the manor's finances, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested, observing his reaction carefully. Bartholomew blanched. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, how did you—" He caught himself running a hand through his hair. "Yes, well, Lady Ashworth's affairs are in a rather delicate state. Croft was always trying to get his hands on some of her more valuable pieces on the cheap. He'd been trying to convince her for weeks to sell him some other items privately before the auction. And you were the one who always insisted everything go through the proper channels, were you not, Mr. Finch?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her eyes were piercing. She had heard that Bartholomew Finch himself had significant gambling debts, a fact whispered in the village, an auctioneer with debts presiding over the sale of a valuable estate and a wealthy, difficult buyer. The potential for manipulation or desperation was evident. Bartholomew shifted uncomfortably. "One must maintain professional integrity, Miss Marple. Though I admit the financial pressure on Lady Ashworth has been considerable, and on me too with this auction. It's a great deal of responsibility." He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on a dust mote dancing in a beam of sunlight. "I also heard," Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering, "that Mr. Croft had secured an item from the Ashworth estate privately some years ago through your agency." Bartholomew's face tightened. "A small, insignificant brooch. Years ago, nothing to do with this." He waved a dismissive hand, but Miss Marple noted the sudden defensiveness, the slight increase in his heart rate reflected in the pulse, beating visibly at his temple. "Miss Marple, I must assure you I had no part in Mr. Croft's death. I had no reason to wish him ill," he pleaded, his voice cracking. He was a difficult client, but he was a client. This is a disaster. For my business, a catastrophe. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. It certainly seems so. Yet sometimes, in the midst of catastrophe, other opportunities can arise, can they not, Mr. Finch? Perhaps to erase a debt, or to acquire something particularly valuable without attracting undue attention. Bartholomew stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension in his eyes. He clearly understood the implication. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed a small, beautifully carved wooden box on a side table. It was made of rosewood, similar in hue to the compass. "A lovely piece," she commented. "Is it an antique?" Bartholomew picked it up, clearly grateful for a change of subject. "Oh, this?" "No, just a trifle I picked up in London. A puzzle. Box, really. You have to twist and turn it just so to open it. Rather ingenious, actually." He demonstrated, and after several precise movements, the lid popped open with a soft click. "Indeed, very clever," Miss Marple observed. "It reminds one, does it not, of how sometimes the most complex puzzles can be solved with a series of very simple, precise actions, and how often the key to a secret is found in plain sight, if one only knows where to look." Bartholomew looked at her, then at the open puzzle box, then back at her, a profound unease settling onto his features. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple knew she had touched upon something. The auctioneer's desperate financial situation, his earlier dealings with Croft, his knowledge of the compass's specific value, and now this odd puzzle box. Bartholomew Finch, she suspected, was hiding something. Perhaps not the outright act of murder, but certainly information that might lead to it. And the key to an old lock comment, combined with the presence of a puzzle box, suddenly didn't sound metaphorical at all. It sounded very, very literal. Chapter 6. Mrs. Vance's Veiled Threats. Miss Marple's gentle inquiries next led her to Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the fiercely competitive collector. The murder of Mr. Croft, while ostensibly a blow to her rival, had done little to soften Mrs. Vance's sharp edges. If anything, it had made her more formidable and somewhat more guarded. One always wondered how long Mr. Croft would last with his unhealthy appetites, Mrs. Vance declared, gesturing with a hand laden with chunky silver rings. She offered no tea this time, merely a steely stare from across her drawing room. His heart was bound to give out eventually. Though the poison, that is a rather scandalous detail, isn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, choosing a hard, upright chair. It certainly suggests a more deliberate act than a mere heart attack. Someone, it seems, wished him gone. Oh, plenty of people wished him gone, Mrs. Vance retorted, a glint in her eye. He was a despicable man. He ruined more than a few reputations, and he was particularly ruthless in his dealings. He once tried to discredit my provenance for a rare Chinese vase, suggesting it was a forgery, cost me a fortune in potential sales and a great deal of public humiliation before I managed to prove him wrong. I made it clear to him then that he would regret any further attempts to cross me. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second. "Regret it how, precisely, Mrs. Vance?" Mrs. Vance gave a thin, humourless smile. "Oh, in the way a collector can make another collector's life a living hell, by outbidding him on every single item, by spreading unflattering rumours, by making sure his reputation as an honest dealer would compromised. I would never resort to violence, Miss Marple, but I assure you my threats were enough to make Mr. Croft very wary of me." This was a surprising admission. Mrs. Vance, for all her aggressive collecting, had always maintained an air of unimpeachable respectability. To admit to such active, if non-violent sabotage was a deviation. It suggested a profound, simmering hatred, one that might, in certain circumstances, overflow into something darker. "And the compass?" Miss Marple inquired. "You seemed very keen on that particular item, if I recall." "It was a magnificent piece," Mrs. Vance conceded, her eyes momentarily softening with a collector's longing. "And, as I told you, Miss Marple, I had reason to believe it might possess a hidden feature, a secret compartment, I suspected. I'd done my research. The rare lotus engraving was a known indicator of such. Croft knew it too. He was practically salivating over it." "And you believe he found such a compartment?" Mrs. Vance shrugged, a gesture of exasperation. "Who knows? He died before he could tell anyone." "But the way he was gloating, the way he clutched it, I wouldn't be surprised if he already had it open. He had a way of getting to things first." "Did you, by any chance, notice Mr. Croft interacting with anyone else in particular besides Mr. Finch during the auction?" Miss Marple asked, changing tack. Mrs. Vance frowned, trying to recall. "There was a rather anxious young man, a new assistant at the auction house, I believe. Pemberton, Arthur Pemberton. He seemed quite nervous, hovering around Mr. Croft a good deal. And then there was Dr. Finch. He was quite attentive to his brother, the auctioneer, and to Mr. Croft too at various points, almost as if he was observing him rather than merely socializing." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her mind filing away this observation about Dr. Finch. It dovetailed neatly with her own growing suspicions about the doctor's role. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Vance suddenly looked at her with a peculiar intensity. "You know, Miss Marple, there was something else. Just before Mr. Croft went down, I saw him make a very odd gesture. He reached towards his other wrist, not the one he clutched, but the one where the doctor later found that scrape. He seemed to be trying to rub something off it or perhaps press something, almost frantically. But then he collapsed." A sudden jolt went through Miss Marple. This was a crucial, unsettling detail. Not a scrape from a fall, not a random mark, but something Mr. Croft himself had reacted to, a final, desperate attempt to dislodge or conceal. Mrs. Vance had provided a missing piece to the puzzle of that mark, making it less of an accident and more a point of deliberate contact. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her eyes alight with new understanding. "That is most illuminating." As she walked home through the winding village lanes, Miss Marple's mind raced. Mrs. Vance's admission of veiled threats certainly placed her on a list of those who disliked Croft, but her description of Croft's final, frantic gesture was far more telling. It suggested that the poison wasn't just administered, but perhaps self-administered in a moment of panic, or that it had been applied so subtly that Croft had only realized it too late. And if he had tried to rub something off, it pointed even more strongly to an external application, a careful and deliberate act by someone who understood exactly how to make it look like a tragic accident. The puzzle of the wound on his wrist was beginning to shift from simple point of entry to a more complex interplay of action and reaction, a new, unsettling layer in the unfolding mystery. Chapter 7. Dr. Finch's Secret Burden, The Revelation. Of Mr. Croft's frantic gesture from Mrs. Vance propelled Miss Marple to reconsider Dr. Alistair Finch's role with renewed urgency. His hasty diagnosis, his dismissal of the wrist mark, and now the possibility that Croft himself had reacted to the poison's application, all pointed to a deeper involvement than mere professional error. She decided a more direct approach was needed. Finding Dr. Finch at his surgery, looking haggard and clearly still shaken by the ongoing investigation, Miss Marple adopted her most sympathetic, yet gently persistent manner. "Dr. Finch, I'm so sorry to trouble you again," she began, taking the seat he offered. "But my mind keeps returning to poor Mr. Croft and that dreadful mark on his wrist." Dr. Finch sighed, running a hand over his brow. "Miss Marple,
I assure you, I've told Inspector Craddock everything. It was a mistake, a regrettable oversight. I was busy, under pressure, and simply didn't see the significance of a minor abrasion."
but it was more than an abrasion, wasn't it, Doctor?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but carried a steel conviction. Mrs. Vance mentioned seeing Mr. Croft touch his wrist just before he collapsed, as if trying to remove something, almost as if he realized, perhaps too late, that something had been applied there. Dr. Finch's composure crumbled. He stared at her, his face draining of color. "Mrs. Vance saw that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. He rose and walked to the window, his back to her, clutching his hands tightly behind his back. The silence in the room stretched, thick with unspoken truths. "Doctor," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm, "you were very quick to pronounce it a heart attack. You dismissed the mark. Why? Were you trying to protect someone or something?" He turned slowly, his eyes filled with a tormented despair. "Miss Marple, you have an uncanny way of seeing things. Yes, I saw it."
The mark! I knew it wasn't an ordinary scrape. It was too precise. And I saw the flicker in Croft's eyes just before he went down. He knew what had happened. And you kept silent. "I had to," Dr. Finch burst out,
his voice cracking. "My brother Bartholomew, he's in a terrible mess, Miss Marple. Gambled away almost everything. Lady Ashworth's estate was his last chance to make good, to earn enough commission to pay off his debts. Croft knew this. He was blackmailing Barty." Miss Marple's knitting paused entirely. "Blackmailing him?" "Yes. Croft discovered a secret about an earlier sale from the Ashworth estate, a legitimate mistake on Barty's part, a misvaluation of a minor item years ago, but Croft threatened to expose it as fraud. He wanted the compass, that particular compass, at a ridiculously low price, or he'd ruin Barty and the entire auction. That's what they were arguing about just before Croft collapsed. Barty was cornered. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. The key to an old lock comment, the private sale, Bartholomew's debts, his unease. It was all falling into place. "So you thought Bartholomew might have—" "I didn't know what to think," Dr. Finch interrupted, running a hand through his hair. "I saw the mark and I thought, my God, Barty must have done something desperate. I tried to cover it up, to give him a chance to explain, to prepare. I thought if I called it a heart attack, the police would close the case and Barty would be safe."
"I'm a doctor, Miss Marple. I took an oath. But he's my brother, my only brother." He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "But Barty swears he had nothing to do with the poison. He claims he just had a heated argument with Croft."
That Croft was demanding he hand over the compass and some additional payment. "He swears he never touched him." "And do you believe him, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle once more. Dr. Finch looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I want to, but if not him, then who? And if the poison was administered via the wrist, how?" Miss Marple considered this, her gaze thoughtful. "A small, precise puncture wound, a digitalis derivative, fast-acting, a man who was blackmailing another, threatening to ruin him, and a compass, that key to an old lock, at the heart of it all." Dr. Finch's confession, while clearing him of murder, had opened up a far more complex web of motive and opportunity. Bartholomew Finch was now firmly placed in the spotlight, and his motive was clear: to silence a blackmailer and save his reputation. But he swore he didn't do it. If the doctor was telling the truth about his brother's denial, then someone else must have seen the opportunity arising from the blackmail and taken advantage of the chaotic scene. The plot, Miss Marple realized, was thicker and far more cunning than she had first imagined, and the person who delivered the poison had to have been very close and very bold. Chapter 8. Lady Ashworth's Ledger. With Dr. Finch's tormented confession, the focus of the investigation tightened around Bartholomew Finch. Inspector Craddock, now armed with the knowledge of the blackmail, was pressing the auctioneer hard, but Bartholomew continued to deny any involvement in the murder, maintaining that he had merely argued with Croft and then watched in horror as the man collapsed. His alibi for the precise moment of poison application was shaky at best, given the chaotic nature of the auction. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced that Bartholomew was the killer. His desperation was evident, but the act of poisoning, particularly in such a subtle and calculated way, seemed out of character for the often blustering and theatrical auctioneer. His brother's protective instincts, while misguided, also suggested that he didn't truly believe Barty capable of such cold-blooded murder. There was another piece missing. She turned her attention to Lady Ashworth, the dignified but financially distressed owner of the manor. The sale of her family heirlooms was a source of deep personal pain, and her vulnerability to someone like Mr. Croft was evident. Miss Marple paid her a visit, ostensibly to express her condolences and inquire about a misplaced pattern for a tea cosy. Lady Ashworth, frail but still lucid, was sitting in her study, surrounded by stacks of papers and ledgers. "Oh, Miss Marple, this whole dreadful business is quite taking its toll," she sighed, offering a weak smile. "The police have been—"
Here again, asking about Mr. Croft. He was always such a nuisance, demanding to see ledgers, questioning the provenance of my family's pieces.
"I heard he was particularly interested in the compass," Miss Marple remarked, her gaze falling upon an open ledger on Lady Ashworth's desk. It was an old, leather-bound volume filled with meticulous copperplate script. Indeed. Obsessed, one might say. He even suggested that it might hold a secret. Something about a hidden will from one of my ancestors, a Captain Ashworth, who died at sea under mysterious circumstances, leaving his estate to a distant relative rather than his immediate family. Croft claimed the compass was originally Captain Ashworth's, and that it contained a codicil, a later will, that would entirely alter the inheritance of the manor. Of course, I dismissed it as nonsense, just another one of his wild theories to devalue my property. Miss Marple's heart gave a little thump. A hidden will, a codicil. This was a far more potent motive than a simple auction rivalry or blackmail. If the compass truly held such a document, its revelation could drastically alter Lady Ashworth's financial situation, perhaps even dispossessing her entirely, or revealing a secret that would damage her family's legacy. "And did Mr. Croft ever manage to prove his theory?" Miss Marple asked, her voice carefully neutral. Lady Ashworth shook her head. "No, thank goodness. He was always digging, though. He'd spent hours poring over old family papers, looking for connections. He seemed particularly keen on the Ashworth family crest, a rather rare design, you see, a falcon with a broken wing. He kept asking about a specific variant of it, one with a small, stylized lotus flower beneath the falcon. The lotus flower, the very engraving on the compass. Miss Marple felt a shiver of recognition. Mrs. Vance had mentioned the lotus. Bartholomew had referred to the key to an old lock. It all connected to the compass and its potential secret compartment. "You say Mr. Croft was looking through your ledgers?" Miss Marple inquired, nodding towards the book on the desk. "Yes, this very one. It's a record of the family's assets, gifts, and even some rather delicate transactions from generations.
past. He wanted to see if any of the entries mentioned Captain Ashworth's will or any unusual bequests.
Lady Ashworth paused, her expression clouding. He was very particular about the handwriting in the early entries. He believed one of the entries relating to the captain's estate looked altered. He even accused a distant relative of forging it to benefit himself generations ago. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to a specific entry in the open ledger, dated 1789. It detailed the transfer of Captain Ashworth's estate. Beside it, in the margin, was a small, almost imperceptible pencil notation. It was a tiny, intricate drawing of the falcon with a broken wing, and beneath it, clearly visible, a small lotus flower. And beside the drawing, almost hidden in the faded paper, were the faint, almost invisible indentations of what looked like a series of numbers. Lady Ashworth followed her gaze. "Oh, that's just a doodle from an idle moment, I suppose."
An old servant's note, perhaps. My great-great-aunt often complained about the Ashworth crest being too plain. Never meant anything, I'm sure. But Miss Marple knew better. A doodle with the precise lotus and falcon motif that had
So interested Croft next to an entry he suspected was forged and accompanied by what looked like a hidden numerical code. This was no idle doodle. This was a direct link, a specific set of instructions perhaps, to whatever was hidden in the compass. Croft hadn't just suspected a secret, he had found the key to it. And someone else, she realized with a sudden, chilling certainty, must have seen him find it, or at least witnessed his excitement at its discovery. The stakes had just risen exponentially. Not just money or reputation, but a centuries-old inheritance, a family legacy, and perhaps even the legitimacy of Lady Ashworth's very ownership of the manor. And someone, determined to keep that secret buried, had silenced Mr. Croft forever. Chapter 9. The Lotus and the Lethal Code. The existence of a hidden code, subtly etched in Lady Ashworth's antique ledger, next to an entry Mr. Croft believed was forged, ignited Miss Marple's intuition. The small, almost invisible numbers next to the falcon and lotus crest, combined with the rumour of the compass's secret compartment, provided a powerful, clear motive for murder. This wasn't merely about acquiring an antique, it was about protecting or claiming an inheritance, a secret that could overturn generations of ownership. Miss Marple returned to the police station, a rare and deliberate act, to speak with Inspector Craddock. She found him deep in conversation with Arthur Pemberton, the nervous young auction house assistant. Arthur was explaining his duties, particularly his responsibility for cataloguing and handling the more delicate items, including the compass, both before and during the auction. "So, Arthur," Craddock was saying, "you had access to the compass for quite some time then?" Arthur Pemberton wrung his hands. "Yes, Inspector. It was my job to prep the display, ensure it was secure, and then to hand it over once it was sold. I handled it many times." "And did you notice anything unusual about it? A hidden catch? A secret compartment? As some have suggested?" Arthur shook his head vehemently. "No, sir. Nothing at all. I gave it a good once-over. Mr. Croft asked me to, actually. He seemed very keen to examine the base and the lotus carving. He was particularly interested in how it turned, or if it had any loose parts, but I couldn't find anything." Miss Marple, listening from the doorway, allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Arthur, in his earnestness, had just provided a crucial piece of information. Croft hadn't just suspected a secret compartment. He had been actively looking for the mechanism to open it, testing how it turned, and he had asked Arthur, a young, impressionable assistant, to help him. She waited for Arthur to finish before approaching the inspector. "Inspector," she began, "I believe I may have found the key to an old lock that Mr. Croft mentioned. She briefly explained the ledger, the falcon and lotus crest, and the faint numerical code. Craddock's eyes widened. A code? In an old ledger? And it links to the compass's engraving and a disputed will? Precisely. Mr. Croft, I believe, found that code. He understood its significance. It was likely a sequence of movements, a specific way to manipulate the compass to reveal its secret compartment. Craddock scratched his head. But if he found the code, why did he die before opening it, or before revealing the will? And if he did open it, where's the will now? Ah, Miss Marple replied, her gaze thoughtful. That, Inspector, is where the method of poisoning becomes paramount. Mrs. Vance saw Mr. Croft try to rub something off his wrist. Dr. Finch saw a precise puncture mark. What if the poison wasn't injected in the usual manner, but rather applied to an object and transferred via touch? Craddock considered this. Like a poisoned thimble or a pin? Or, Miss Marple suggested, her voice dropping to a near whisper, what if the key to the lock wasn't just the numerical code, but a physical action?
A sequence of twists and turns like that puzzle box Mr. Finch showed me. And what if the poison was applied to a part of the compass that one would have to press or twist precisely in order to open it? A chilling possibility dawned on Craddock. You mean Mr. Croft opened the compartment and in doing so poisoned himself? Not necessarily himself, Inspector, Miss Marple corrected gently. Think of it. Mr. Croft, a man of avarice and impatience, finds the code. He is triumphant.
He is speaking with Mr. Bartholomew Finch, perhaps even showing off his discovery, or gloating about the secrets he's about to expose. He then attempts to open the compass using the specific sequence, pressing and twisting the mechanism that the code dictates, and someone else has placed a minute amount of fast-acting poison, a digitalis derivative, on that precise spot. A spot that would only be touched by someone attempting to open the secret compartment. Craddock gasped. So, the killer knew about the code, knew about the secret compartment, and knew Croft would try to open it. They made him, in essence, trigger his own demise. Indeed, it means the killer wasn't necessarily physically present to administer the poison at the exact moment of collapse, but rather laid a trap that Croft himself activated, probably in the very antechamber where he fell moments after his heated exchange with Bartholomew Finch, and possibly after finally understanding the full implications of the ledger's code. Craddock began to pace excitedly. But who knew about the code, the compass's secret, and had access to that specific poison, and the means to apply it so subtly to a specific part of the compass? Miss Marple's eyes, however, were fixed on Arthur Pemberton, the nervous auction house assistant, who had turned a ghastly shade of green. He had access to the compass, he had handled it. He knew Mr. Croft was trying to open it, and he had been tasked with making sure it was secure. But more importantly, she recalled something else he had mentioned earlier, a tiny, seemingly insignificant detail from a previous conversation that suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her as she realized the depths of cunning involved. The murderer was someone who was not only familiar with the compass and the ledger, but also with Mr. Croft's habits, and crucially, was entirely above suspicion. The true murderer was about to be revealed, not by their obvious guilt, but by their subtle, almost invisible culpability. Chapter 10. The Gentle Unveiling. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and disparate, now aligned with chilling precision in Miss Marple's mind. The hidden codicil, the lotus engraving, the numerical sequence in Lady Ashworth's ledger, the poisoned compass, and Mr. Croft's final desperate gesture, all led to a single, inescapable conclusion. It was time for the gentle unveiling. Miss Marple requested a quiet gathering at Ashworth Manor. Present were Inspector Craddock, Dr. Alistair Finch, a still distraught Bartholomew Finch, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, and a very pale Arthur Pemberton. Lady Ashworth, too, was there, clutching her lace handkerchief, looking frail. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but resonating with authority. "We are here to speak of Mr. Silas Croft's unfortunate demise. As we now know, it was not a simple heart attack, but a meticulously planned murder, designed to look like one." Craddock nodded. "Indeed, we believe the poison was applied to a specific part of the compass, which Mr. Croft then touched, activating his own demise." "Precisely," Miss Marple affirmed. "The killer knew of the compass's secret compartment, the code to open it, and Mr. Croft's fervent desire to do so. They knew he would handle it, perhaps even open it, during the auction." She turned her gaze to the assembled faces, lingering on each for a moment. Mr. Bartholomew Finch had a motive, blackmail. Mrs. Vance had a motive, long-standing rivalry and resentment. Dr. Finch had a motive for covering up, to protect his brother, but none of them fit the precise method. The poison was a digitalis derivative, a highly specific substance, Miss Marple continued, and the application required an intimate knowledge of the compass's mechanism as well as a great deal of nerve and precision. It also required access to the compass over a sustained period to prepare the trap, and it required a killer who would be overlooked. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Arthur," she said, her eyes now fixed on the young assistant, who visibly trembled. "You told us you handled the compass many times. You even said Mr. Croft asked you to examine the base and how it turned. You were responsible for its security before the auction. And you, Arthur, also worked part-time for Dr. Finch in his surgery, helping to organize his dispensary." Arthur's face was now ashen, his eyes wide with terror. "The digitalis derivative," Miss Marple went on, her voice losing none of its gentle calm, "is a common heart medication derived from foxgloves. Dr. Finch, of course, had access. But so too did his assistant who helped with the dispensary. You, Arthur, would have known exactly where to find it, and you would have been able to take a minute amount without suspicion." Arthur began to shake his head, a desperate denial forming on his lips. "You, Arthur," Miss Marple continued, undeterred, "also mentioned to Mrs. Wither, the postmistress, that Mr. Croft was always so lively. But you also added, rather tellingly, that he always had a way of getting to things first. You admired that about him, didn't you? You admired his shrewdness. And you watched him pore over Lady Ashworth's ledger, saw him discover the falcon and lotus crest and the faint numerical code. You, Arthur, saw him finally understand the key to the compass." "No, I just helped him with the compass," Arthur stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "Indeed you did," Miss Marple said softly. "You helped him. You were right there when he was trying to decipher the mechanism. And you, knowing how important that will was, how it could change, the ownership of Ashworth Manor decided to ensure that you would be the one to find it. You saw an opportunity to secure a reward from whoever stood to benefit from the codicil, or perhaps to claim it for yourself, playing the role of the innocent discoverer." She turned to Lady Ashworth. "Lady Ashworth, your distant cousin, Mr. George Pemberton, was the true heir mentioned in Captain Ashworth's codicil, was he not? The codicil, I believe, would have entirely dispossessed your branch of the family and enriched his, and Arthur, here, is his grandson. The codicil would have made Arthur, indirectly, a very wealthy young man." Lady Ashworth gasped, clutching her chest. Arthur knew this, Miss Marple concluded. He knew the code, and he knew Mr. Croft would open the compass. So he meticulously applied the digitalis to the specific part of the compass that would be pressed or twisted. When Mr. Croft, in his triumphant glee, finally deciphered the mechanism and pressed that spot, he activated his own death. Arthur, you then removed the codicil after the collapse.